Good evening to one and all. I'll be talking about the role of quantitative fundus autofluorescence in inherited retinal disorders. So here we have a patient seen in 2018. So if we see the fundus autofluorescence pictures of both eyes, the top two images, they show a central area of hypoautofluorescence. And we saw the patient back in 2021, 3 years later. So they show a larger area of the hypoautofluorescence centrally. So how we quantify it is probably what we'll learn through the presentation. So what is quantitative autofluorescence? It's basically the study of the autofluorescence intensity, which is combined with spatial information. So there are main two types of autofluorescence: a short-wave autofluorescence, also known as the blue fundus autofluorescence, and a near-infrared autofluorescence. So we will be discussing mainly regarding the short-wave autofluorescence, as it is the most commonly used modality in quantifying autofluorescence. So there are a set criteria which we need to follow. So it requires a 30 by 30 degree field and a uniform illumination of the fundus, a good pupillary dilatation of at least 7 mm. Bleaching is for 20 to 30 seconds. So first, the near-infrared images are always acquired along with the OCT, and after that, we go in for the blue fundus autofluorescence images. So what are the factors? So what factors does quantitative autofluorescence take into account? So the most important factor is there is an internal autofluorescence reference which is mounted in the instrument. So this reference actually compensates for the change in the laser power and the detector gain and allows for comparison of images obtained longitudinally. So this reference is simultaneously excited during each image acquisition, and the fundus autofluorescence images can then be normalized to the standard reference signal independent of the camera settings. Some other factors which are important are no histogram stretching. So histogram stretching basically occurs in a conventional fundus autofluorescence where there is increase in the image contrast due to change in the image processing. The other factors, I won't go in much details, but one important thing to be noted is the optical media correction. So we all of us know that lens takes a part in quantifying that autofluorescence. It reduces the intensity of the autofluorescence. So the machine takes care of it. Also, in pseudophakic patients, there is a transmission factor which is in the software which calculates and compensates for the changes in the autofluorescence. So only after correction of the above factors, it is possible to make a comparison between the subjects. So coming to the image analysis for quantitative autofluorescence, so there are two softwares which we need to know. One is the IGER software and the HiX software. So we have the HiX software with us at Shankar Nethralaya, but the IGER software is not there. So both softwares are required for quantitating the level of autofluorescence. So in image A, we see that the measurement areas are divided into 3 concentric rings. So this is the inner ring, the middle ring, and the outer ring. So there are a total of 25 segments. Each ring contains 8 segments in addition to a central foveal area. And we also get the color-coded maps. Each pixel is assigned a color based on the associated quantitative autofluorescence value. So the dark blue colors, the cooler colors, stand for the normal, the low, the hypoautofluorescence. And as the colors, as the warmer colors, usually yellow and red, they signify a greater amount of autofluorescence or hyperautofluorescence. And one more important thing with this is that the retinal vessels in the areas of atrophy are excluded from the analysis by this automated testing. So what are the approaches used in the measurement of quantitative autofluorescence? So one is the mean QAF8 approach. It stands for the mean quantitative autofluorescence of 8 segments in the middle ring. So why middle ring is chosen is because it is less subjected to image-related variability than regions located closer to the image borders. And at an eccentricity of 7 to 9 degrees from the fovea, so that is also very important because its absorption is not affected by the macular pigment. And this approach is mainly used in the diagnosis of cone rod, cone dystrophies, and Stargardt disease. The second approach is the region of interest approach, in which the localized area of autofluorescence is studied. So this is a patient of RP, who's having the hyperautofluorescent ring, And the region of interest approach actually calculates the autofluorescence values at select regions in the ring, within the ring, and just external to it. And these are actually compared to a normal person, an age-matched control, where, to see if whether there is actual increase in the autofluorescence or it's within the normal limits. So before we know what is abnormal, so we must know how the quantitative autofluorescence is in healthy eyes. So these levels increase with increasing age in whites, women, and smokers. And superotemporally, where this black box with the cross is there, so here they are the highest, and inferonasally they are the lowest. Coming to the discussion of inherited retinal disorders, we start with retinitis pigmentosa. So this short wave autofluorescent ring is a dynamic feature of the RP fundus. It's also known as a Robson Holder ring. So we see that this ring represents an abnormal accumulation of lipofuscin in the retinal pigment epithelium. So there is a progressive constriction in the diameter of the ring, which signifies progression. So they reflect a transition between the abnormal and normal retinal function. So if you carefully observe this fundus shortwave autofluorescence image is the SD-OCT. So internal to the ring, there is relatively normal retinal function. So the outer retinal layers here are well organized. We can see the ellipsoid layer, external limiting membrane. And in the region of the ring, the ellipsoid layer starts distorting. But external to it, in this area, there is absent function, and these layers are not nowhere to be seen here. So these rings are not genotype specific and are observed in variants of RP. So these rings are due to mainly increase in the fluorophore deposition. They provide data at a single stage of the disease. So benefits of quantitative autofluorescence in RP, basically it depends on the stage of the disease. So here, this is taken from a study of quantifying fundus autofluorescence in patients with retinitis pigmentosa. So there are 3 patients here, P1, P2, and P3. So if we compare the patient P1 with P2 and P3, so here the classical Robson Holder ring is very well seen as compared to these 2 patients. So when they compared this with age-matched normals, so they found that this patient did not lie within the confidence limits. And with these 2 patients tend to lie in the confidence intervals. So coming to cone and cone rod dystrophies. So the 3 main types of genes which cause cone and cone rod dystrophies are ABCA4, PHPR2, and RPGR. They classically reveal a bullseye maculopathy, and it can be associated with bilateral RP atrophy. So how quantification actually helps in cone and cone rod dystrophy. So now I would like to show this image consisting of these 2 different patients with a bullseye maculopathy type appearance on autofluorescence. So the normal autofluorescence, if you compare these images, you can't really say whether there is increase in the autofluorescence, in the background autofluorescence or not. But when we compare the color-coded map, which signify quantitative autofluorescence, in an ABCA4 positive patient is high background autofluorescence is there, and in comparison to the ABCA4 negative. So they found these results in many patients with ABCA4 positive, and hence these correlations can help in the selection of patients for ABCA4 related clinical trial. So this is another study published in the American Academy of Ophthalmology in the year 2020, in which they studied around 230 patients. 230 patients underwent genetic testing, and they studied the quantitative autofluorescence levels. So they actually found out that the quantitative autofluorescence 8 levels, which is the mean quantitative autofluorescence which I previously described, it was elevated in patients having these genetic defects. There was normal quantitative autofluorescence in these genetic diseases, and MERTK and RDH5 had decreased quantitative autofluorescence levels. So when genetic testing actually fails to identify the cause of the molecular disease, QAF may provide the insights into the pathogenesis. So high quantitative autofluorescence levels were actually can be associated with a dysfunctional ABCA4, disrupted outer segment integrity, and high rate of cell death. So Also, a low quantity autofluorescence levels are maybe associated with slowing down of the visual cycle, reduced RPE phagocytosis, and abnormality of the Brooks membrane. So such pathway considerations are useful in interpreting the molecular genetic findings in a research setting. Coming to Stargardt's disease, we know it's the most common form of juvenile macular degeneration. So regarding quantitative autofluorescence, there are two main things which we need to look at. One is the mean quantitative autofluorescence and the autofluorescent fundus flex. So studies on Stargardt's disease were mainly done to find out if quantitative autofluorescence approach would facilitate inter-patient comparison in genetically confirmed cases of ABCA4 associated disease. So they found that the spatial distribution of autofluorescence was similar to that seen in the healthy subjects. So again here, the patient A is a healthy person, and B to D are persons with Stargardt's disease detected at different stages. So we see the normal color-coded map in the patient A, and these are age. So this is the disease progression. So as we move on to C and D, the quantitative autofluorescence values in the around the central fovea seem to increase. So patient C here has a lot of hyper autofluorescent flecks, which correspond to the red color in these images. So once the flecks atrophy in the later stages of the disease, the quantitative autofluorescence actually is seen to coming to the next disease, which is the Best disease. It's basically the hallmark of the disease is that a central oval lesion, which appears as an egg yolk, exhibiting intense autofluorescence. So there were always questions regarding whether Best disease is a pan-retinal disorder or whether the gene mutation can cause only a focal effect. So EOG, as you know, measures the transepithelial potential difference across the RP and not in a localized state. So increased autofluorescence in Best disease was due to the unphagocytosed outer segment membrane in the SRF and the bisretinoids and the bisretinoid precursors. So the reports of increased lipofuscin have always been based on non-quantitative assessment. Quantitative autofluorescence studies on Best disease have shown that the autofluorescence level within the lesion as compared to the non-lesion retina, as well as the same fundus area in healthy eyes, were found to have increased, and the mean non-lesion quantitative autofluorescence was within normal limits for age. Coming to another disease, choroideremia. So the difference between this disease and the others what we have discussed is that here they have actually quantified the area of involvement and not the intensity. As we all know, the choroideremia, there is a centripetal loss of function manifested as a loss of autofluorescence, which typically progresses steadily over a patient's lifetime. So how quantification of autofluorescence helps here is there is a index known as the choroideremia index, which actually calculates the expected residual autofluorescence for a given age. So if we see in this table here, so when the patient is young, the rate of area of retinal loss is far more higher than when the patient is older, where the rate of residual remaining function still decreases, but it's to a lesser extent. So beneficial, so there's use in assessing the optimal time point at which we can actually intervene with emerging treatments such as gene therapy. So choroideremia index is basically when we see the area of residual autofluorescence plotted against the age in years. So the gradient of this line is known as the choroideremia index. So obviously the diagnosis of inherited retinal dystrophies is a challenge, and we need to look at all the modalities used, such as ERG, SD, OCT, in addition to autofluorescence, because the mutations in different genes can be associated with similar phenotypes. So for instance, patients having ABCA4 associated disease can present with either a bullseye phenotype or a pattern dystrophy. So again, a bullseye phenotype can be associated with genes such as RPGR and PROM1. So coming to the limitations of quantitative autofluorescence, so they cover only a small area of the posterior pole and ignore the specific lesions outside this area. And there is some, obviously there will be discomfort while imaging during especially in the blue autofluorescence light. Also, it requires a trained and a committed operator, and the installment of appropriate internal fluorescent reference is also quite difficult. So just coming to the conclusion, it's a non-invasive, quick, cheap, and easy to perform tool. They have definitely the studies have expanded our appreciation of inherited retinal disorders that involve changes in the lipofuscin distribution and concentration. One most important thing is that it establishes the genotype-phenotype correlations. However, it cannot circumvent the need for genetic testing, though can provide some indication of how likely a specific gene is the cause of a patient's phenotype. It can definitely serve as a biomarker of disease risk and disease progression. And there's utility in assessment as outcome measure in clinical trial. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujay. To summarize, actually, there are two types of quantifying. One is to quantify the area of the hypo or the hyperautofluorescence, and which was what he showed in the choroideremia index. And the second way is to actually quantify the intensity of the hyperautofluorescence. And the problem with that is actually we need a dedicated software for that, and also we need a internal reference to be fitted onto the machine. So this is not available in our Spectralis actually. Even the software is actually a third-party software. It's not provided by the Spectralis company actually. So it's definitely an important research tool, and in future we will definitely be looking at these. Currently, yes, we are not using it. At least the quantitative autofluorescence we are not currently using.
How does this differ from FLIO? Fluorescence lifetime imaging ophthalmoscopy also depends a lot on quantitative autofluorescence. So how will is this different? So Jay, when you read, did you find that anywhere?
There are articles, ma'am, but don't know the details really.
Yeah, because that also depends a lot on the quantitative autofluorescence for certain conditions like MACTEL and all that.
Okay.
That's why I wanted to know, because I haven't come across any article where the two overlap. So I just wanted to know because they all have some kind of quantitative element in them.
All right.
I think just a little comment on what ma'am asked. If I remember correctly, FLIO measures the amount of time the particular molecule stays in a excited state. So that is a different kind of quantification which is done. Here it is the intensity and area that we are doing. But of course, we have to see how they two measure along with each other. Only one thing that which I have found in the clinic is that I think for us from here on, whenever we ask for autofluorescence, it should by default mean Heidelberg autofluorescence, because even now sometimes the photographer takes the other fundus photograph and autofluorescence on the other machine, Zeiss. I think that really interpretation doesn't help, follow-up also doesn't help. So we must remember one take-home message should be that it always should be Heidelberg and only Heidelberg and not anything else. And where inherited retinal dystrophy is concerned, the importance is so much that I would rather miss ERG than miss autofluorescence, especially if you are going to look for progression of disease, because ERG in RP is going to be flat right from to begin with, but autofluorescence is something which can be measured and follow-up can be done and patient can be told whether the disease is progressing or not. So this is one parameter which is extremely important for progression of disease.
So I think we can wind up the class today. Thank you, everyone. All three of you presented very well, nice and very concise, and a lot of learning points. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you. All very nice presentation, all three of you. Thanks.